Yet another giant that I feel like I'm introducing. Yesterday we had Jessica McCabe as our keynote speaker, and today we have Professor Nancy Doyle. Uh,
Who is 5'2" and isn't used to being referred to as a giant. I don't think it's ever happened.
Well, you're a giant in your field, I would say, even if you aren't maybe in your length. But she's the CEO of Genius Within, and she then moved on to Chief Research Officer in September of 2021, and a proud neuro-minority herself. She's very passionate about improving the way neurodiversity is treated in the workplace. She's also a founding member of the British Psychological Society Working Group. I can go on and on. There are so many qualifications on your list, Nancy. But one that I am especially interested in myself is your research work in evaluating coaching and demonstrating a tangible impact from a manager's perspective. It was commended by the BPS. And in 2019, you were also recognized for your contribution in policy impact in occupational psychology. I just, in May, was part of the World ADHD conference that was being held here in the Netherlands. This year, it will be held in 2 years in Prague, of course, very much aimed at all the researchers and also all the practitioners that are treating as psychiatrists and psychologists, people with ADHD. And I was actually appalled by how little attention there was being paid to the coaching aspect, even if ACT and CBT treatments were being studied, and coaching was a big part of making sure that ADHD people actually start to practice what they're taught in those CBT and ACT projects. But the coaching in itself is rarely studied, the impact that the coaching has or has not, and if what happens if you do or do not pair those sorts of psychoeducation treatments with coaching. So I'm very grateful to have your work at least to rely on. Your work was also featured in the BBC Two series Employable Me and the follow-up Employable Me 2, which you helped design and deliver. And the program aired in 2016 and 2017, focused on the employment barriers faced by neurodivergent individuals.
And I believe was also syndicated in the Netherlands and Australia and Canada.
Yeah, though I haven't seen it myself. So I don't think it was promoted very much by the Dutch.
It didn't have me in it, darling. That's what happened.
But I do think, it led to more attention of the Dutch broadcasting system for this. We also saw a television show around one of the ADHD coaches that here in the Netherlands was my hero. She's deceased right now, but she started a coaching school for ADHD that is still going strong. But lastly, you are also regularly invited to speak at national and international events and on television, and you're a regular contributor on Forbes on disability and inclusion. I really devour your writing every time a new piece comes out, because I think you are a master at succinctly stating the issues and connecting the dots, also for an audience that might not be completely up to speed yet. So I think that's wonderful. You're really helping to educate the world. And with that,
thank you.
Hand over the reins to you.
What a lovely thing to say. I've just written a Forbes blog this week, actually, about leadership lessons that I've gained from Madonna. I had a really good time writing that article. It's not about neurodiversity specifically. It's more in the vein of feminism, because that's the other thing I tend to write about. But
I think the intersectional element has been pointed out in these past 2 days a lot, and so important.
Thank you. So yes, thank you very much for welcoming me. I'm really honoured to be asked to come and do your keynote today, and it seems like you're having an absolutely lovely conference. As I dropped in earlier to some chats, that was just a really nice vibe of camaraderie and kind of, a bit of peer support for the issues that we all face in our various settings and our various expertises. So mine is the workplace. I've worked in the field of disability inclusion my whole life, actually. My first job was as a support worker in a locally based hospital unit for adults with learning disabilities and autism. And so I kind of became a psychologist because all the psychologists annoyed me, and all the psychologists that I'd spoken to when I wasn't going to school, which was a pretty regular thing, they annoyed me too. And one of my 17-year-old twins actually coined a little phrase. We were talking about careers, and he said, "Mum, is your entire career based on a grudge?" And I said, yes, pretty much. That's exactly what's happened. I'm going to be a psychologist so that I can make them all better, because they're not doing a very good job right now. So I'm still working through that, as you can imagine. But yeah, as an ADHD and myself, and not being diagnosed until they changed the rules about how early you had to have symptoms. When they changed it to 12 when I was 38, and I had a diagnosis within 3 months of that rule change. So it was a fairly clear-cut case of girl ADHD gets ignored in the 80s and then gets a diagnosis bingo of absolutely everything else. So that's my kind of personal vestedness in this, and I thought it'd be quite good. We've moved on in the 20 years that I've been doing this, 20 odd years ago, since I kind of really started focusing on neurodiversity and supporting businesses and supporting employees and supporting unemployed people who are neurodivergent. In that time, I used to have to kick the door down to get people to think about neurodiversity. Nobody was using that kind of language, whereas now it's more of a kind of stampede, which has led to a different problem, which is like a wild west of information that people are now kind of trying to pull through because it's so overwhelming. But we were doing a kind of complex case review at work with some of my workplace needs assessors, and one of them had a really negative experience where she'd gone to do a workplace needs assessment, and it was quite clear that the manager and the HR director just wanted this person out, and they weren't interested in what could be done to make this person able to, and everybody was horrified. And I remember thinking back, 20 years ago when I was doing workplace needs assessments, they were all like that. It was always like that. The managers were just keen to get everybody out as quickly as possible. And the employees were kind of really misunderstood and bullied and discriminated against. And now we're much more likely to see workplace needs assessments where there's two interested parties coming together to go, what could help make this even better? What could we do to benefit this person to help them work at their best? Which is a real cultural change that we've been part of. And I'd just like to acknowledge Rebecca and her colleague from the previous talk, who, that is not the case in school yet, but hopefully where the employment market goes, the schools will eventually follow. So I don't want to bore you with the usual kind of, overview of overviews. What I want to do is come up a level and go, where are we in this cultural change in the workplace? What kind of progress have we made, and how can we get to the next level? So I've worked for a few years on this idea of levels of inclusion. And, at the moment, as we know, there's still statistically significant levels of occupational exclusion. Neurodivergent people are not participating in the labour force to the same degree as neurotypical people. Some work from the Office of National Statistics in the UK found that 83% of abled people are employed, compared to an average for disabled people of 53%. But for the autism community, that's 29%. And for the community of people with intellectual learning or developmental difficulties, it was 22%. So we still have significant levels of exclusion from the labour force for neurodivergent people. And you can go, to other places. So a third of long-term unemployed people are dyslexic, 25% of the criteria for ADHD, 70% of the prison population are illiterate. It goes on, it goes on. And what we've been doing, which I referred to in my little story about workplace needs assessment, is we've been doing workplace needs assessments, and we've been following the legal guidelines around compliance. So the legal guidelines from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in about 2006, 2007, brought most of the world's economies into line around the idea of adjustments or accommodations. So if you have a disabled person, your job as an employer their environment, workflow, tools or equipment to enable them to work at their best. And, you know, that's been in place for quite some time now, and we've got quite good at it. The problem is it doesn't scale terribly well. So what we're effectively doing is we're waiting for people to put their hand up and ask for help. And then when they put their hand up and ask for help, we will apply a little fix to them, one person at a time. And although we've got quite good at that, and as Saskia has noticed, which I'm very glad, it's always nice when people have actually noticed the work that you've done and have read it and find it helpful, you know, that we've started to get somewhere in terms of understanding the impact of those compliance-based inclusion activities. So we know that adjustments are quite successful. My own research looking at the way coaching operates as an adjustment is that it leads to performance improvements by fine-tuning those adjustments for individuals and by mediating the relationship between the individual and their manager so that they both come to a really good conclusion about how to move forward. So, you know, we've got some good data on adjustments working. The next thing we have kind of looked at as a society is what I'm calling here deliberate inclusion in teams, and what you will probably know as the Neurodiversity at Work intervention programs. So often autism at work, often in the tech industry, and these are kind of, you know, more, they're proliferating. There's more and more of them. They're not just autism in tech anymore. That's where they started, and they've very much expanded, and they're kind of, you know, pretty much every tech company has got one, but increasingly so are finance companies, so are defense departments, insurance companies. You know, we've got various things happening to make these programs more available. But where we should be heading is exactly what Rebecca was saying as I joined the call. We should be heading for a place where inclusion is standard, where our environments don't require so many adjustments because they are already fairly inclusive for people, and people can already work in their best. You know, what we have designed as a society is a world that works for the average person. You know, the average person being there, and then sort of, you know, a small one standard deviation below or above the norm, you know, in the bell curve. We've made a world that's for that big fat part in the middle, and the people at the ends don't really fit in. So if you're not good at literacy, numeracy, sitting still, fine motor control, or concentrating when there's lots of sensory overwhelm, you're going to need a flexibility or a change to the system, because the system isn't set up for you. So we need to work out how are we going to move to this fabled future of work, which is desperate for creative thinking and innovation, which neurodivergent people bring in spades. But we can't get there because we don't know how to fundamentally change our workspaces. So that's what I want to talk to you today about, really, is you know, what's the problems with the things that we've done so far? Why are they not complete pictures? Why are they not the end goal? And then how are we going to get to this fabled future of work where it's neuro-inclusive and people are able to be their best creative selves because they have been enabled. So I just want to share a bit of kind of fairly hot off the press research with you. So yeah, we're here, I think. I've just put a little arrow. I forgot about my arrow. There's an arrow. We're here. We're kind of halfway between compliance and doing deliberate inclusion, and we're still quite away from systemic inclusion. Okay, so the compliance model then, let's have a little unpick of the compliance model. So the compliance model is based around adjustments, and it's based around this kind of gatekeeping approach to those adjustments. So in order to get adjustments for everyday performance, you pretty much have to be diagnosed, which has long waits and costs lots of money. You then may or may not need a workplace needs assessment, the educational equivalent of, which tends to cost even more money. Then you might also get some one-to-one support around assistive tech or coaching, and where all those things lead to is things like, you know, wear noise cancelling headphones if you're in an office, use a color coding strategy in your diary, book admin time for yourself 3 times a week, be able to use a quiet meeting room if you've got a detailed report to write, work from home privileges 3 days a week. You know, the things that you end up with as the adjustments are usually an absolute fraction of the price of getting there. And then as well, we've got these hidden costs underneath for all the people that don't disclose. And the people that don't disclose tend to be the people that have additional marginalizing characteristics and are therefore less willing to add to the stigma that they're already dealing with. And so, you know, in that hidden cost of people that aren't getting adjustments, you've got higher levels of people who are marginalized by race or ethnicity, higher levels of people from the LGBTQ community, higher levels of women, higher levels of people from working class backgrounds. So, you know, adjustments, we understand what this process is. We understand lots about adjustments now, but we're not distributing them in an effective way. It's very cost inefficient. It's not going to scale, and it's excluding too many people in ways that are incongruent with our drive towards diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So I did a study with my Birkbeck colleagues, led by Professor Almut McDowell, who was my PhD supervisor starting over 10 years ago now, and we've just carried on working together because we absolutely love each other. So we did a huge survey in the UK with 985 neurodivergent employees and 127 employers of neurodivergent people. And I just want to caveat that if the employers were answering the question, they were probably at the top end of neuroinclusion already. So they're not necessarily a representative sample, but the employees were a more representative sample. We've got most neurodivergent, neurominority conditions covered. We've slightly weighted towards ADHD and autism, so we corrected for that in our analysis. There's ways you can do that with statistics. So we looked at from an HR perspective, this is the money the money question. You know, are you planning to leave in the next year? Because from a human resources perspective, turnover as staff is the most expensive thing that you're trying to prevent from happening. It's a huge cost sink. It's not just about the cost of putting out the advert and the time taken to do the recruitment. It's also about the loss of informal knowledge, the loss of company wisdom, the difficulties in relation building that slow productivity, and generally speaking, turnover is an issue for businesses. So as you can see from these diagrams, having adjustments tailored to the individual meant that nearly 75% of people were unlikely to leave. I've just spotted a typo. Sorry, it's unlikely. It's two unlikely to leaves on the right hand side, not likely to leave. So most people who had adjustments tailored to them were unlikely to leave, whereas the flip is true for people that had no adjustments. They were very likely to leave. So this is more evidence that adjustments really supports turnover. However, it's not the only game in town. So we did something called a regression analysis, which is where you look at your output variable, which is whether or not that person's intending to leave, and you cross-reference it with a number of potential causes, and to see which of those causes is the most influential on that output variable. And so when we looked at adjustments and combined them with, you know, other things like how supportive staff were, how much company knowledge there was around neurodiversity, psychological safety, you know, what we found is that tailored adjustments actually are only just getting off the starting line. What was more important was the support of your line manager, the sense of psychological safety you had in the workplace, and that includes kind of being recognized for who you are, being able to be, you know, being able to demask, but also being able to raise problems without fear. That's a big component of psychological safety. But by far and large, the most important predictor of whether people were planning to leave or not was career satisfaction. And career satisfaction includes being in a job that you feel is commensurate with your skills and ability, but also the sense that you might get promoted from the team that you're in. And so the conclusion we've come to is that adjustments are kind of like a hygiene factor. They're what we call in psychology a hygiene factor rather than a motivator. And hygiene factors and motivators are different, because a hygiene factor, if it's not there, it will demotivate. But if it is there, it won't motivate. And it's kind of a metaphor. So if you imagine going to a hotel, if the hotel you went to was really clean, that probably isn't the first thing you'd say about it. You'd say, I really liked the decoration, the room size was good, I liked the view, the bed was comfy. But if it wasn't clean, that is the first thing you'd say about it. You know, we got to the bed hadn't been made, there was dirt everywhere. So we call these hygiene factors, and we think adjustments are like a hygiene factor. Actually, in order to sustain and develop the careers of neurodivergent people, that's where our attention should be if we're wanting to do neuro inclusion well. It's the adjustments are a baseline. They're never going to get you to the promised land of neuro inclusion. Oh, that's just a bit more. So then let's come to the idea of deliberate inclusion. So the old autism at work paradigm. And I've been quite critical of that of late. And I am quite critical of it because it's not moving us on. So, you know, we've got some problems with the autism at work paradigm. As I've already said, it tends to be operating in industries that favour fairly well-resourced, white, Western, male professions. And it also tends to be focused around autistic people. So it's not necessarily including ADHDers, dyspraxics, people with Tourette's syndrome, people with intellectual disabilities. It's got a kind of, yeah, it's not as inclusive as those. So I've been saying this for ages, and about a couple of years ago, I thought I better go and do the research to make sure I'm not just making stuff up. So instead of kind of just pontificating about it, we did a survey with 576 autistic people who were all kind of 38. You know, they're in the middle of their careers, but full age range was 17 to 65. We had a reasonably representative sample for a study led by an English university. So we had a good range of ethnic minority, people minoritized by race and ethnicity. We had a large percentage of LGBTQ respondents, which is not unusual for the autistic community. And we were only 54% female, which is there's usually more women than men in any survey, because women are more compliant about filling in surveys, and men are more protective of their time. That's a known problem in psychology research. So when we looked at the autistic people in our survey, you know, 67, around 2/3 of them had at least one co-occurring condition, which I thought was interesting. You know, so this whole kind of autism at work, what about all the other things? Well, even the autists at work have got a bunch of other things. So, you know, the idea of segregating and putting people into categories of different kinds of neurodivergence, I think, is really about to have its day. I think we're moving on from that. We did invite people who were self-diagnosed to contribute. We found no significant differences between the self-diagnosed population and the formally diagnosed population. And we were asking about things like masking, inclusion, stress levels. You know, there are no differences. And by the way, I've always done this in every survey study I've ever done. I've always allowed people that were self-diagnosed and formally diagnosed to contribute, and I have never found a significant difference between those populations in terms of their psychological experience. What we did find as a difference is that there were more white males in the formally diagnosed group than there were women or people who'd been minoritized by race or ethnicity. So that is, you know, again, what we were expecting to find. We also found that white males were disproportionately represented in co-occurrence of neurodivergent conditions, but women were more disproportionately likely to have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. So, you know, yeah. Anyone surprised? Anyone surprised so far? Am I surprising anyone? No. Just laying down evidence for you all to reference so that no one can argue with us when we're making our points. That was the point of this study. We then looked at masking and experience at work. And again, hands up anyone that's surprised that women were masking 15% more than men, or that Black people were masking more, 35% more than white people. Anyone surprised? No one surprised. And again, you know, people without accommodations were masking more than people with accommodations. So this is all fairly standard stuff. When we got to look at those who were actually in employment on autism at work programs, we found that the ratio of male to female was 7:1 compared to the global diagnosis difference of 3:1. So I think there is a significant issue there with the with the way that we do the autism at work paradigm. And we also found that 72% of white autists in our survey were employed, compared to only 57% of Black, Asian, Hispanic and mixed heritage people. So we, you know, the talk that I had been going around giving to the tech industry called Autism at Work is Sexist, Racist and Classist, discuss. I think I now feel I can say that with a bit more certainty. And this is my overall problem with the with this deliberate inclusion. You know, if you compare it to other forms of diversity and inclusion, like, so if you wanted to increase racial diversity in your company, you wouldn't say, oh, I've heard Chinese people are really good at maths, let's go and employ some. If you wanted, you wouldn't say, oh, I've heard Germans are really good at logistics, so should we get some German project managers in? If you, you know, if you wanted to increase gender diversity, you wouldn't say, oh, I've heard women are really good at multitasking, so let's get some into the admin team. Like, you wouldn't do that in any other form of diversity and inclusion. And the reason you wouldn't do it is because it's illegal to do that. So I think that we're skating quite close to the wind in autism at work. And my problem as well is, I mean, it was a phenomenal innovation in the late noughties by SAP. You know, what they did was groundbreaking, because what the switch that they flipped was the idea of including disabled people because of the skills they bring, rather than because we're having a pity project. And that is massive. And I think that's a huge part of the wave that's come lately in terms of understanding that neurodivergent people have something to offer the world. That is a huge part of it. But SAP's program started in 2007. They still only have 150 people employed on that program against an international staffing level of 150,000. So they're still at less than 1% of their workforce being employed, and that's not a population prevalence. And I think long term, how do you get promoted out of the Autism at Work scheme? You know, does that, you've basically stigmatized yourself potentially. You've disclosed confidential medical grade data to all your colleagues in the entire business at once, just by virtue of being on that program. So I feel like long term for career potential, and given that we know career potential is where we should be looking, this is potentially, we're undermining some of those goals. I think the other issue is around what we failed to learn is the main lesson. So when people start Autism at Work programs, what they do is they change the recruitment techniques. They allow people to do work sample testing instead of interviews. And it turns out when you do that, you get people that are really good at the job. So the lesson should be, when we're hiring for software teams, let's get rid of interviews and let's do work sample testing. Not let's keep interviews for normal people and do work sample testing for the people that have got a piece of paper that says they don't have to do what normal people do. Do you know, that's the wrong lesson to learn. We've missed the lesson. The lesson was that the way we were recruiting was wrong, because we were systematically excluding a population of people who, it turns out, are rather good at the job. And it's the same across the whole flow. You know, the way that we set up our systems of entry is continually disabling people who could be good at the job. At Genius Within, when I'm hiring for our finance team, I give people a spreadsheet full of holes. I give them a set of made up management accounts that doesn't work. And I say to them, you know, what do you think of these? And then if they email me their answers, if they want to talk them through on the phone, or if they want to meet me in person, or if they want to do it on video, I don't really care, because the method of communication is irrelevant to the job. What I need in the job is someone who knows how to work an Excel spreadsheet and who can make meaningful assumptions from patterns in data. That's what I need to measure. Conversely, if I'm hiring someone for our coaching team, I will interview them because I need to know how quickly they can build rapport with people that they've just met for the first time, because that's an essential part of coaching. But conversely, I don't necessarily care so much if their CV or resume is full of holes and, you know, typos. That's not the job. The job is being interpersonal. So, you know, there are things that we should be learning from these neurodiversity at work interventions and special projects that we're not learning. We're not taking it to the next level, to the next system level. And that's why they're not enough. So the question is, how do we do that and how do we scale? And so, you know, what you've got a lot of at the moment is you've got a lot of people trying to automate some of the things that currently cost money. So we've got lots of people trying to automate diagnosis. And I think we need to take diagnosis out of the equation in the workplace. I don't think diagnosis is relevant to work. I think we need to flip the cost model, ignore diagnosis, because we know that diagnosis is sexist, racist, and classist. We need to ignore disclosure because we know that disclosure is sexist, racist, and classist. And we need to start by preparing for everyday typical functional performance difficulties in HR and universal design. What we can then do is we can automate recommendations of accommodations. That can be automated because you don't need to collect medical data for it. It's much more reliable. And then we can funnel people down through to only those who really need it end up with the one-to-one in-person workplace needs assessment. Only those who really need it end up in diagnosis and clinical provision from a workplace perspective. I'm not commenting on our health services. Our health services still need to invest in diagnosis and clinical assessments. You know, the fact that they're not is a completely different talk, quite frankly, but we could do that. So the reason I don't want to automate diagnosis is because the Equality Act and its international comparisons, so anything based on the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, does not require just diagnosis to make adjustments. The criteria for disability is not based on a label. If you're diagnosed with diabetes tomorrow, you may or may not be disabled. If you're diagnosed with ADHD, you may or may not be disabled. Disability isn't a medical label. Disability is defined by legislation as a difficulty in functional day-to-day activities or performance that lasts or is expected to last for 12 months or more. That is how disability is defined. And we don't need to do medical diagnosis to find that out. We can just look at how somebody is performing at work, and we can start with the assumption that they might need adjustments rather than they're lazy or demotivated. My second point is that diagnosis is unreliable. So I'm showing you a little graph on the screen here, and it's got a number of different coloured avatars. And this is from a study conducted by Duncan Assel and his colleagues at Cambridge, where they did cognitive profiling of sort of functional performance, things like memory, literacy, verbal skills, visual spatial reasoning skills, those kinds of things. They did a cognitive profile for 1,500 people, all of whom were either diagnosed with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, developmental language disorder, or dyscalculia. There was a small cohort with no formal diagnosis, but those people did still have an educational healthcare plan. They then put all of the scores that those people got for the various things, you know, verbal skills, memory, processing speed, all the different things they were measuring. They put them all into a stats analysis, and they asked the stats analysis to cluster them. So to say, what do the scores tell you here? And what they found was 3 clusters: a cluster of people that were struggling with language, a cluster of people that were struggling with executive functions like planning, time management, and organization, and a cluster of people that were struggling with social communication and managing emotion. And what you'll see represented by the colors in the graph is that which cluster you ended up in bore almost no relationship to the diagnosis that you had whatsoever. They could not replicate the diagnostic constructs with using objective measured tests in which no clinical professional had to interpret behavior. So just looking at performance of tasks without doing any kind of social interaction and, oh, do we think this person makes good eye contact or do they not make good eye contact? What do you call good eye contact? Is yours same as mine? How are you rating that? Do we think this person fidgets a lot? Well, what's your baseline for fidgeting a lot? Because, you know, my dad's from New Jersey and everybody talks with their hands. My mum's from Berkshire and everybody sits very primly. So, you know, what's your baseline for what we're calling fidgety? So when you take all of that out of it, and there are no socially constructed behavioural norms that we're measuring, we cannot replicate diagnosis. And then I refer you to my previous point, diagnosis is sexist, racist, and classist. And just as an example, this question is from the AQ10, which is the most widely used autism questionnaire. I like collecting details about things, for example, cars, birds, and trains. Now, how many autistic women do you know who are going to interpret that literally? And because it says because it doesn't say I like to collect details about things, for example, pop stars, cats, and makeup, they're going to say no. Am I right? Cars, birds, and trains, they're like, no, I don't do that. So, you know, we've got all these things built into the system. So in short, we do not know enough about this to program an algorithm. Even if you get over the ethical issues of diagnosing someone online and how psychologically terrifying that might be and how vulnerable that person might be, even if we get over that, which I personally don't think we can, and I would never do it for that very reason. Even if we get over that, the very constructs that we're measuring are subjective, and we cannot program an algorithm to do that kind of subjective thing. So I hope I've persuaded you that online diagnosis is never going to work, and that's why we have to ignore it at work. These are the reasons why we have to ignore diagnosis in the workplace. If we're going to get neurodiversity to the next level, we have to start ignoring diagnosis. What we can rely on is the spiky profile. So what was present in that cognitive testing was the spiky profile. People that had low spikes in language compared to everything else, people that had low spikes in executive functions compared to everything else, people that had low spikes in social communication and emotion compared to everything else. So the spiky profile, the very idea that some people have specialist thinking skills and some people are kind of average across the board, that stands. That's still there. We can rely on that. And so then we come back to the point of understanding neuro-inclusion in the workplace. And the point is to understand what these adjustments are and to be data-led about them and to understand how we can scale adjustments rather than applying them one person at a time. And in order to understand adjustments, it's not just the person that we're considering. It's not just their spiky profile. It's their spiky profile in context of the role that they have, in context of the environment that they have. And I'll show you what I mean by showing you my spiky profile using the Genius Finder questionnaire that I've been working on for the last few years. So I've given myself a spiky profile here. So I'm using those kind of broad functional performance categories, spoken language, writing, numeracy, reading, self-organizing, memory, movement, dexterity, visual skills, creativity, social interaction, emotions, and sensory. And this is me rating what I'm finding easy in my job right now and what I'm finding hard in my job right now. And you might look at that and you go, so she's given herself an average of 2.03 for the organization questions. She must be better organized at that because, you know, she's got a PhD and she started a company from scratch. And you probably don't know this, but I've also got twin teenager boys, you know, so she can't be that bad. But the point is, I'm bad for the job I'm doing. So I'm not bad, but it is my weakest spot. And for the job that I'm doing, it's not enough. I'm always going to be all right with numeracy. There are very few jobs that I'm going to try and do that I haven't got the numerical reasoning ability for. That's one of my skills. But for the job I've got, I struggle to, I book 2 appointments in my diary at the same time. I start the day and forget to look at my diary, and then completely fail to turn up to events like this and have people ringing me going, Nancy, where are you? You know, those things happen to me on a weekly basis. I am not organized enough for the job I have. I also struggle with managing my emotions and my sensory overwhelm in the job that I'm currently in, because I think Saskia introduced, I handed over the CEO-ship of my company in 2021, mainly because of this stuff, by the way. I'm a great entrepreneur, creative, numerate, rah, rah, rah. But actually being the CEO of a company with over 200 people in it requires a completely different skill set. And as an ADHDer, that's not my skill set. My skill set is starting things, not keeping them consistent. So I did hand over that job, but my dear friend Jackie, our CEO, who's a dyslexic thinker, by the way, she's really good at, you know, she can't write Forbes blogs as quickly as I can, but she can keep a consistent organization. But she unfortunately had some really serious health treatment that took her out of action for 3 months, and it was very concerning, and it could have potentially been life limiting. You know, it turns out it's not, and she's coming back to work, and that's all lovely. But I did this spiky profile during the period where I had to step back in and deputize for her because she was out of the business. So in that context, managing the emotions of a very nervous business during a time of change really just set off all my sensory sensitivities. Because I was so anxious, I wasn't coping with sensory either. So if I do this again, I might actually have a slightly different profile. When I was an independent contractor and the only person's emotions I had to handle was my clients and myself, I might have given myself a 4 out of 5 for that. But this scale is coming from sort of 75 individual questions. So it's about my spiky profile of how I am in my role in the environment that I'm in now. It's a cross-sectional snapshot of what I'm finding easy and what I'm finding hard. And this we can automate. So this is like the client data in a workplace needs assessment. If I was doing a workplace needs assessment to find out what workplace needs I had, I would ask these types of questions and I would work out where the pinch points were. So this is something that can happen automatically online. And then it kicks out a report for me. So for every question that I've said I've got a slight problem with, it's going to give me a recommendation, question, recommendation, question, recommendation. And I'll show you some of those in a minute. But what this does that I absolutely love is it starts scaling it. So what you're looking at now is not Nancy's spiky profile, it's Genius Within's spiky profile. So this is 73 people in Genius Within have taken this same assessment, and this is now telling me where our strengths and weaknesses are as a company. We've got more dyspraxics than I thought. Look at the movement. Lordy, I didn't know we had that many dyspraxics, but there they are. What you can see is that as a company, we've got a fairly spiky profile, which is not surprising given that 68% of Genius Within staff are neurodivergent and or disabled. But it's not massively spiky. You know, we've got some good coverage on numeracy. We've got some good coverage on literacy skills, our reading concentration. We've got quite a wide gap. We've got quite a few people that really struggle with that. When it comes to self-organizing, we don't have enough people that are brilliant at that. So we've got this sort of middle of the road thing. And when I did this with my team about 6 months ago, we decided, looking at this, we would hire a project manager, because there weren't enough of us that were good at that at senior levels. So we needed someone who was really good at organizing. And oh my God, I cannot tell you the difference this woman has made to my life. She is absolutely phenomenal. All those kind of long-term, important, but never urgent projects, she's got them all timelined. She's broken them all down into tasks. She's giving those tasks to people one thing at a time. She's just holding it. It's amazing. What you can also see in Genius Within's profile is that we have a lot of people that get sensory overwhelm at work, a lot. So what this now says to me is, how do we look at our environment? Is our environment good enough for people that have sensory needs? Actually, we have 2 offices. One of them is probably good enough. One of them probably isn't. And we have a lot of people working from home. So that then made me think, you know, We all did working from home assessments during the pandemic, but have we revisited them lately? Have we got people working from home who are actually living in a flat above a busy shop, who are trying to hold meetings when actually it's quite noisy in their environment? Would they actually be better off going to a shared office space and having the ability to hire one of those, to sit in one of those booths to run some of the things that they're running? Can they actually handle where they're working? And where I'm getting to with all this is what this aggregated data is allowing me to do is neuro inclusion at the organizational level. This is the data I need to let me know what I need to do to move the baseline up so that there are more people who are accommodated by the standard practice at Genius Within. And some of that comes from changing the environment and looking more at the environment. Some of that has come from hiring specific. The other thing we did is we've been doing time management workshops as part of our CPD Prof. For the year. We've got a planned CPD for the year because someone came along and taught us how to use project management template. So instead of randomly doing CPD whenever everybody's cross, we actually have a plan for CPD, and it happens on an annual basis. And there's a budget and everything. I mean, it's amazing. But looking at it this way has allowed me to think as a business leader, what does my business need? What does my business need as an accommodation? How do I scale? And when I'm doing it from the business perspective, it's cheaper, it's easier, fewer people have to put their hand up and ask for help. And more importantly, they don't have to be at the point of no return and just about to head into burnout before they put their hand up and ask for help, because we're putting these things in as a preventative measure rather than as a reactive measure. And I'll just give you some example of the strategies. So what this questionnaire does is, it's asking, at the moment it's asking 75 questions, but I've got a new version coming out with 67, which is annoying me because it's not a smooth number, but I'm just going to have to live with it because it is the right number. Although I have got three, no, anyway. So if we're asking you some questions about reading, about concentration when reading and writing, in the generic version, we might advise you to wear headphones to block out background noise. But what we do with this is we actually edit all of the recommendations because in partnership with the organisation. So we're working with the National Health Service. And of course, if you're a paramedic, you can't wear headphones to write up your client notes at the end of a call out. You can't do that. What you can do is lean with your back against a wall or with your back against the ambulance so that you're reducing the degrees of that distracting noise can come from. So what we do is we work with the adjustments team or the human resources team or the occupational health team, whatever they've got, to look through all of our recommended strategies and make sure that they can apply to that workplace before anybody starts using the questionnaire. And we can also put in links. So if they've got an employee assistance program, we can put a link for how you book that. If they've got, part of their annual training budget is for memory skills or communication skills or feedback skills, we can link to those references for each organisation. So in doing that, we're doing the 3 bits of the adjustments profile. So we're asking people to tell us about themselves, and we're simply trusting them to have a good idea about what they're finding easy and hard. We're looking at them in the context of their role, and we're making recommendations that are suitable in their environment. We're doing all 3 things. And I think we can automate this. And when we do that, what happens is we're then, so for example, Lloyds Bank have been using this with us for a year. We've got 1,000 people that have filled it out. They've got a very spiky profile. And in their spiky profile, so what I'm going to do for them at the end, coming to the end of their first year using this stuff, is I'm going to write them a nice report. And I'm going to say, this is your spiky profile over the last year. This is what you want to get into your budget for next year, because this is where your pinch points are as a business. And, looking at some things like working and self-organizing, actually, you've spent X number of thousands of pounds on one-to-one coaching. But if you just put this in as workshops on a rolling program, you could reduce that cost by X, and people would just sign up to it rather than it being the dyslexia course or the ADHD course or this course. You could just call it the memory course or the organizational skills course. And then people are going to feel less stigmatized in joining it, but you're also going to open it up to all of the other kind of acquired conditions that result in a spiky profile, like long COVID, like perimenopause, like a thyroid dysfunction, like people who are returning from cancer treatment. So you're kind of making it more of a standard system rather than at something that's, you know, special course for the special people. It's gonna lose that. And so you use the data of the accommodations and flexibilities that you've provided in the past to predict what you're going to need in the future, and then you can put that stuff in as standard. And over time, as we get more and more information flowing through and more aggregate data, we just generally start to move the business towards a more inclusive standard and a more inclusive baseline. And we can, you know, when we're looking for recommendations, we look at these all around the employee life cycle. So we look at job design, and that's my thing about there aren't many people that are good at self-organizing. You know, we've designed jobs for generalists. So, you know, every job requires a certain amount of admin, planning, time management, thinking of the bigger picture and breaking it into small chunks. Actually, should we be doing that, knowing that we've got so many neurodivergent people? Let's design jobs for those specialists, and let's bring in a different kind of specialist to do the thing that they can't do. And then once we've designed jobs that allow people to be masters as well as rather than jacks of all trades, we can hire for specific missing skills, matching recruitment to role. You also, if social communication was a particular weak spot for a business, we might recommend a different way of contracting. So, you know, every company has a standard code of conduct. We might say, actually, you're going to need to make that more explicit because it's ambiguous. And we might look at kind of, you know, being more detailed about unspoken social rules. We can plan training around our missing skills. We can do appraisals better, and we can look at where stress is coming from. So if people have got it, if there's a well-being issue in the business, we can look and see, well, is that stress coming from cognitive load, i.e. lots of people that are struggling with memory and self-organizing, or is it coming from social issues? Is it coming from sensory issues? So we can even fold this into our well-being. So that's basically what I think is the answer to this problem. And I'm kind of in beta testing, and this is my kind of thinking around it. And I'd really be interested in your feedback. You know, is this the vehicle that will get us from A to B in terms of understanding how to do neuro inclusion? And I'm going to stop sharing, but I'll just pause for a minute in case anybody wanted to screenshot the contact details. So warning, 4, 3, 2, 1. And now I've stopped sharing. There you go.
Oh my goodness. And see, I'm just like blown away with all the data and so many ideas and so many thoughts that are racing up in my head right now. There's a massive question from the participants. Are we able to get a copy of your presentation?
Yes. Please do. Please take my slides, use my slides. I always ask that you reference me as the author of my work, but provided you do that, I have no need to hold on to them and not let people have them. So have them.
Yes. And when you ask at the end, you know, it's like, okay, this is how you see, you know, how we can address neurodiversity at work. And I'm just like, why can't we not, you know, we're supposed to be not just prototyping this. We're supposed to be rolling it out now, you know, in organizations, in businesses. You've done such a comprehensive work already in how you've been using all these different, you know, especially the spiky profile. There was even a question of where can they get a spiky profile? Do they test for it? And also, there you go.
Yeah.
Also the research, the link.
So the research I've just popped in the chat. So that's the link to the Centre for Neurodiversity Research at Work. We've got a mailing list. We usually manage to get 1 or 2 updates out a year, but we've also got a resources page and a link to all our research page. So you can download all of our papers, including the 2 that I've shared with you, which was the big survey of neurodivergent people at work and the evidence around workplace adjustments, which there's much more detail in there as well. There's research about what managers think of whether or not adjustments are useful, you know. So if you're looking for evidence to support an inclusion program and you want things to take to budget holders in your business and say, you know, this is some evidence, you've got buckets of evidence in there. It's all there for free. And then the Autism at Work study is on there as well. That's there in a very kind of academic style in the research, but in resources, the slides that I've shared are there as well. So feel free to use either the accessibility version or the academic version. And on those graphics that you can get from that you can download from Birkbeck, it's also got alt text. So in terms of disability accessibility, it's there. It can be read by a screen reader for someone who's dyslexic or someone who's visually impaired or blind.
Thank you so much. I can imagine that everybody is also reeling after today's keynote, and perhaps the invitation, do connect with Professor Nancy in LinkedIn.
I'm always good for LinkedIn, although I'm inconsistent, unsurprisingly, on LinkedIn. So I do sometimes give myself a complete break. So if you're looking for something very specific, it's best to get in touch via the company website. And I'm just putting the link to the questionnaire as well. It's available online for individuals to do. It's got the generic strategies on it. So if you do it, you'll get the generic strategies. And we've priced it at £30 a person, including any taxes, which is about half of what our competitors are charging for the same sort of thing. But for businesses, we do more subscription models. But yeah, we're about to go to version 3 in September, which is just another level up in terms of the way it's organized, but the one we've got is in quite good shape anyway. Okay, does anyone, I mean, those were 2 questions. Was there anything else people really wanted to know? I'm aware I haven't left loads of time.
I think they're digesting in the I would say simmering with ideas. There's a question from Rebecca. Can it be used for children?
No, it's not used. It's not designed for children. And as I kind of said, I'm not a child specialist. What I can tell you is that Portsmouth County Council and Hampshire County Council, Portsmouth City Council and Hampshire County Council have been working on something very similar. It's not as, so mine is quite teched up, you know, it's disability inclusive. It's been given a disability review by a third party. It's got, you know, you can change the contrast. It's got speech to text enabled. It's UX, its user design is really, really advanced, and I don't think theirs is. But what they're doing is not dissimilar. They're doing it. What they decided is, you know, what are common everyday available adjustments, and so what they've been doing is empowering teachers and Senkos to have a bank of resources that are common everyday adjustments. And they then can just draw on those when and as they need, rather than waiting for children to have an EHCP for an accommodation that might be as simple as can leave the class 5 minutes early to avoid corridor crush. I mean, it's ludicrous, isn't it? In the education system, it's even worse than work. You haven't just got to pay for a psychs report. You've got to do a speech and language and occupational therapy. You know, parents are spending £3,000 just so that someone will give their child permission to wear their tie loose. It's just the biggest waste of money known to humanity. You know, and they're always saying they haven't got enough money for special educational needs, but I'm not bloody surprised. You've spent it all measuring people. Just, you know, when they say that they feel really overwhelmed when their tie is too tight, let them loosen it. It's really not that hard, is it? You know. But yeah, schools sadly have more in common with prisons than they do in workplaces. So yeah.
There was a mention here from Donald, though, of that he's missing the gifted people in the presentation.
Well, I talked about how you compensate for the struggles, but what you'll also see is the gifted people in the spiky profile. The whole point of the spiky profile is that it's both. And so, you know, another way to look at this is to do a spiky profile of a high performing team, and then you know what skills you need to recruit for. You know, you do. So if you find that actually you're, so, you know, going back to Genius Within Spiky profile, we did have a, you know, we've got a huge bubble of people in the creative zone. So how do we recruit for creativity? Because it's clearly what's working at Genius Within is having all those creative people. So you know, you can use it for both, but time is limited, Donald. But yeah.
Well, thank you, Prof. Nancy. And we will be sharing the recording and also asking the presentation. Wait a week, at least for us to decompress after today. And we will be sending out the recordings for all the sessions. So thank you again. And I would like to just invite everyone to just turn off, and so we can just give Prof. Nancy a round of applause. Or
Thank you.
So please unmute yourselves and say thank you if you want.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And to Grace, open plan offices, that's what they all have in common. Open plan bloody offices, or big, loud, noisy warehouses, or manufacturing plants. Noise pollution is probably the thing that companies all have in common that they could all do with dealing with.
Yeah.
Yeah.